Our journey through the history of renting a home begins in the cradle of civilization, where the concept of a home first evolved. In ancient times, the idea of renting as opposed to outright ownership was a nascent but vital aspect of communal living. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the world's earliest urban societies, the concept of renting was already in practice 5,000 years ago. Clay tablets from this era reveal rental agreements with specific terms and conditions, indicating a sophisticated understanding of property and tenancy. These agreements often included details such as the duration of the tenancy, the amount of rent, and the responsibilities of both landlord and tenant. In ancient Egypt, meanwhile, land was predominantly owned by the pharaoh, temples, and a wealthy elite, with the majority of the population living as tenant farmers. They would rent the land they worked on, paying a portion of their produce as rent. This system was not just an economic arrangement but also a reflection of the social and religious order, where the pharaoh was seen as a divine ruler and the ultimate owner of all land in Egypt. In ancient Greece, the concept of private property and rental agreements became more prominent. In classical Athens, the growth of democracy and commerce saw an increase in the renting of residential properties. Landlords were often members of the upper class, while tenants were typically lower-class citizens or foreigners. Rents were paid in various forms, including money, crops, or labor. The legal system in Athens provided some protection for tenants, such as the security against sudden eviction, reflecting the societal recognition of the importance of stable housing. The Roman Empire further advanced the legal aspects of renting. Roman law detailed various forms of lease agreements for houses, shops, and even agricultural land. The legal code from this period, including the famous Justinian Code, contained specific sections outlining the rights and obligations of both landlords and tenants. This included stipulations on the fair collection of rent and the maintenance of the property. In urban centers like Rome and Pompeii, multi-story apartment buildings called insulae were common, and these were typically rented by the less affluent citizens, including artisans and laborers. The landlords of these buildings were often from the wealthier class, and the quality of these rental accommodations varied greatly, from luxurious apartments to cramped, poorly maintained quarters. In Asia, during the same period, societies like ancient China and India had their own unique practices regarding land ownership and renting. In China, during the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, land was distributed according to the feudal system, where the king granted land to lords, who in turn allowed peasants to work on it. While not renting in the modern sense, this system determined social status and wealth. In ancient India, the concept of land ownership was tied to the caste system, and land renting was prevalent, especially in agricultural contexts. In the Roman Empire, the legal frameworks and societal norms surrounding renting continued to evolve. The insulae of Rome, often cramped and precariously built, were home to a significant portion of the urban population. Despite the risks, including frequent fires and structural collapses, these apartment buildings remained the most practical solution for accommodating the city's burgeoning populace. Landlords, typically from the patrician class, saw these buildings as lucrative investments, despite often neglecting their maintenance. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the onset of the Middle Ages, Europe's approach to land and property underwent a significant transformation. The feudal system, which became the cornerstone of medieval society, was not based on the concept of renting as we understand it today, but on the principles of lords and vassals. Land was held in exchange for service, often military, rather than for monetary rent. This system, however, did lay foundational concepts for later rental practices. Serfs, working the land for their lords, were allowed to live on the estate and keep a portion of the produce in return for their labor and allegiance. This arrangement, deeply rooted in the feudal hierarchy, set the stage for later forms of tenancy and landholding. In contrast, the Byzantine Empire, inheriting the traditions of the Eastern Roman Empire, maintained a more sophisticated urban development where renting of houses and shops was common, especially in cosmopolitan cities like Constantinople. Here, the state played a more active role in regulating the buildings and ensuring fair practices in renting. Meanwhile, in Asia, different models of land ownership and tenancy were emerging. In China, during the Tang, 618 to 907 AD, and Song, 960 to 1279 AD dynasties, rapid urbanization and the growth of commerce led to a more pronounced rental market. The Chinese imperial system, with its bureaucratic control over land allocations, also influenced how properties were rented and maintained. In India, the classical and medieval periods saw a mix of feudal-like systems and more centralized state control, with land ownership often tied to one's caste and social status. However, in both rural and urban settings, renting was a common practice for those who could not afford to own land or houses. The Islamic world, spanning from the Iberian Peninsula to the edges of the Indian subcontinent, also developed unique approaches to property and renting. Islamic law, or Sharia, provided guidelines on transactions, including renting, emphasizing fairness and the welfare of the community. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, renting was a common practice among the urban population, with properties often owned by the wealthy and leased to merchants, artisans, and other city dwellers. As Europe transitioned from the medieval period to the Renaissance, the concept of renting began to slowly resemble its modern form. Europe witnessed significant changes in its social and economic structures, which in turn impacted the nature of renting. The Renaissance, a period marked by a resurgence in arts, science, and culture, also saw cities flourish as centers of trade and commerce. This urban revival led to a growing demand for housing, particularly in burgeoning city centers. In response, the concept of renting became more formalized. The rise of a wealthy merchant class meant that more people could afford to rent, leading to the construction of larger, more comfortable urban dwellings. These residences, often rented by the emerging middle class, were a far cry from the cramped insulae of ancient Rome. In parallel, the Enlightenment period furthered the development of individual rights and the rule of law, aspects that gradually began to influence tenancy agreements and property rights. The legal systems across Europe started to offer more protection to tenants, recognizing the importance of housing stability for social harmony. This period also saw the first instances of what could be considered early forms of social housing, particularly in response to urban overcrowding and the poor living conditions of the lower classes. Across in Asia, particularly in China and India, the story of renting took a different path. In China, the Ming, 1368–1644 AD, and Qing, 1644–1912 AD dynasties saw continued urban growth. The imperial examination system and the resultant bureaucratic class led to the development of urban centers around administrative hubs. Renting was common among the officials and scholars who frequently moved between postings. Chinese landlords, often part of the gentry, rented out not only land but also housing in urban areas, with contracts and tenant rights being influenced by Confucian ideals of fairness and moral duty. In India, the Mughal Empire, 1526–1857 AD, oversaw a period of relative stability and prosperity with a complex system of land revenue and administration. Land ownership often conferred status and power, and the renting of agricultural land was widespread. In urban areas, the Mughal period is noted for its architectural legacy, including the development of grand cities like Delhi and Agra. Within these cities, renting was a common practice among traders, artisans, and the vast retinue of the imperial court. The situation in smaller countries and island nations during these times also mirrored these diverse approaches to renting. In many European small states and principalities, as well as in the burgeoning colonial empire's island territories, the patterns of land ownership and renting often reflected the larger continental trends, albeit adapted to local conditions and needs. The colonization of the Americas introduced new dynamics in land ownership and renting. European settlers brought with them their concepts of landholding, which often clashed with the indigenous practices of communal land use. In North America, land was initially seen as a vast resource to be settled and cultivated, leading to a system where land ownership was tied to individual rights and social status. As colonies grew into towns and cities, the practice of renting homes began to emerge, particularly among workers who moved to urban centers seeking employment in burgeoning industries. In South America, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers established large estates or haciendas and encomiendas, systems where the land was granted by the crown along with the right to demand labor from local indigenous people. While these were not rental systems in the strictest sense, they did establish patterns of land control and use that would influence later practices. As urban centers like Buenos Aires, Lima, and Rio de Janeiro grew, the renting of urban dwellings became more common, particularly among the lower and middle classes. The Caribbean islands, with their strategic locations for trade and their agricultural value, saw a different pattern. Here, land was primarily used for plantations, and the housing of workers was often tied to their employment on these estates. However, in the towns and ports that service these agricultural hubs, renting was a common practice, especially among merchants, sailors, and transient workers. As the 19th century progressed, the United States experienced a significant transformation with the Industrial Revolution. This era saw a massive shift from rural to urban living, with people flocking to cities in search of work. The rapid urbanization led to a housing crisis, with a high demand for affordable urban housing. This period saw the rise of tenements, particularly in cities like New York and Chicago, where landlords would rent out small, often overcrowded and poorly ventilated apartments to low-income workers. These conditions highlighted the growing need for better housing policies and tenant rights. In contrast, the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Latin America saw a mix of rural and urban renting practices. In rural areas, tenancy continued to be tied to large estates, with tenant farmers working the land. In cities, The growing middle and upper classes often opted for European-style housing, renting spacious apartments or houses. The urban poor, however, faced conditions similar to their counterparts in North American cities, with overcrowded and substandard housing. The early 20th century also witnessed the growth of government intervention in housing. The appalling conditions in tenements and the need to house growing urban populations led to the first instances of public or social housing. Initially, these were often seen as a means to address the worst housing shortages and improve living conditions for the poorest citizens. In the United Kingdom, the Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1890 and subsequent legislation marked the beginning of state involvement in housing provision. Similarly, in the United States, the New Deal era of the 1930s saw the federal government playing a more active role in housing construction and management, particularly with the establishment of the Federal Housing Administration and later the United States Housing Authority. The interwar period in Europe and North America saw further developments in rental housing. Art Deco and modernist movements influenced the design of apartment buildings, with a focus on light, space, and functionality. These styles often reflected the new technological advancements and the optimistic belief in progress. However, the economic turmoil of the 1930s and the impact of the Great Depression profoundly affected the housing market. Homeownership became out of reach for many, and renting remained the only option for a significant portion of the population. The two world wars also had a profound impact on housing. The destruction caused by the wars, particularly in Europe, resulted in a severe housing shortage. Post-World War II, this shortage led to various innovative solutions, including the use of prefabricated buildings and the construction of large, state-sponsored housing projects. In the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries, massive communal apartment complexes became a standard feature of urban planning, reflecting the communist ideals of equality and collective living. In Asia, the post-war period marked significant changes in countries like Japan and South Korea, where rapid industrialization and economic development led to urbanization and a consequent need for urban housing. Governments in these nations undertook extensive housing projects, often focusing on high-density apartments to accommodate the growing urban populations. As the world emerged from the shadows of World War II, the landscape of renting and housing continued to evolve, shaped by the rapid changes of the 20th and early 21st centuries. In the post-war era, many countries experienced a housing boom, driven by economic growth and increasing urbanization. This period saw the rise of suburbs, particularly in the United States and Canada, where single-family homes became synonymous with the middle-class dream. However, in urban centers, apartment living remained prevalent. High-rise apartments, offering a blend of affordability and practicality, began to dot the skylines of cities worldwide. The latter half of the 20th century also witnessed significant shifts in housing policies and tenant rights. In Europe, social housing projects initiated in the post-war period continued, but with a growing emphasis on quality and tenant welfare. Countries like Sweden and the Netherlands became known for their innovative and humane approach to public housing. In contrast, the United Kingdom and the United States saw a gradual move towards the privatization of public housing and a focus on home ownership, which led to a decrease in social housing stock, but a diversification in the types of available rentals. The advent of technology and globalization in the late 20th and early 21st centuries further transformed the rental market. The internet revolutionized how rental properties were listed, searched, and leased, bringing unprecedented convenience and efficiency to the process. The rise of online platforms and mobile apps made it easier for landlords to manage their properties and for tenants to find and rent homes. This era also saw the emergence of the sharing economy, with platforms like Airbnb disrupting traditional rental markets, offering short-term accommodations and challenging regulatory frameworks. In recent years, the concept of co-living has gained traction, particularly in densely populated cities and among younger populations. This modern form of communal living, where residents share living spaces and amenities while renting private bedrooms, reflects the changing attitudes towards ownership, community, and personal space. Simultaneously, the rise of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb has led to significant regulatory challenges. In an effort to tackle the housing crisis, many governments worldwide have started imposing restrictions or outright bans on such platforms. Cities grappling with limited housing stock and skyrocketing rents have found that the proliferation of short-term rentals can exacerbate these issues, reducing the availability of long-term rental properties and driving up prices. This trend often impacts local residents who find themselves priced out of neighborhoods popular with tourists. Furthermore, the global phenomenon of mass migration, both international and from rural to urban areas, is intensifying these housing challenges. As more people move into cities seeking better opportunities, the demand for housing increases, leading to higher rents and a more competitive rental market. This surge can strain existing infrastructure and create socio-economic divides as long-term residents and newcomers compete for the same resources. These shifts also bring to light deeper issues such as gentrification, where the character of neighborhoods changes, often at the expense of lower-income, long-standing communities. The influx of wealthier residents can lead to the displacement of local businesses and residents, altering the cultural and social fabric of neighborhoods. Additionally, the increased demand for housing can lead to the development of informal settlements or slums in some cities where adequate housing is not available or affordable. These developments suggest a complex and evolving narrative in the story of renting and housing. While new living models like co-living offer innovative solutions to changing lifestyles and needs, the broader impact of global trends on local housing markets presents ongoing challenges. Balancing the need for affordable, stable housing with the dynamics of a globalized world remains a critical task for policymakers, communities, and the real estate market alike. As we continue to navigate the complexities of modern living and grapple with issues like affordability, sustainability, and urbanization, the evolution of renting remains an integral part of our collective journey. It's a story that continues to unfold, with each development reflecting a new chapter in the diverse and rich tapestry of human history. If you enjoyed this historical journey, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Each new viewer ignites our drive to share more tales from the past. Thank you.